All right, people of the world, Evan Benton, Dogg from Air, coming at you with a book review slash report. And we got to be clever and tricky with this one because I'm going to try and get it onto the YouTubes. So the title is in the description or the title of this video. I'll show it here. You can see what we're talking about. Harris L. Coulter, subtitle, The Medical Assault on the American Brain. And I'm reading it on this lovely Kobo e-reader, which I highly recommend that you pick it up if you do a lot of heavy reading like I do. Saves your eyeballs from the dreaded blue light. So anyway, yeah, we're going to use the code word carrot in lieu of the big scary V word that might get us kicked off of YouTube. And we're just going to pray, and we're going to cross our fingers that this video makes it, because I think this is one of the most important books that I've read in a long time, and I've been super excited to get it out here into the world and get some more eyeballs on it. So, of course, you can download it. It's better if you buy the book, of course, but if you're a sneaky guy like me, a sneaky poor guy like me, you can download the book at piracy sites that I don't recommend anywhere. So, yes, this book is written in 1990. The fellow's a PhD. I don't know what his PhD is in, but it's something medical related. And the basic premise of this book is that the carrots do not only cause autism, but they also cause ADHD and plenty of more subtle symptoms, all the way up to and including sociopathy and criminal behavior. So the gist of the book is that the massive crime rate increases that we've been seeing over the past 70 years or so have been largely due to these carrots that we're making all the kids munch on. So I'm not going to really be talking about the criminal aspect of it. I'm more going to be talking about the medical aspect of it, the health aspect of it, and kind of the mechanisms there. And what I'm going to do for the first part of my video here is I'm going to just sort of give my brief summary. And then for the second part, I'm going to actually just read from the last chapter of the book, because the last chapter itself actually gives a super concise summary. So you'll have a good idea of what's going on in this book, but I highly recommend that you actually pick up a copy yourself and give it a read through. He's got some other interesting books on the same topic. So before I get into it, the book was written in 1990. So look at what Dr. Andrew Wakefield, which I might even get banned just for saying his name on YouTube, but look what he was doing in those years. And his reports or his papers from those years didn't even get retracted. Okay, so I mean, the point that I'm trying to make is this is like early days in sort of like the modern carrot hater movement. So it's just always, when you look back at the people who have done this work on exposing the effects of carrots on people's health, it's been going on for a long time, and basically none of their even back into the 19th century, none of their criticisms ever get addressed by the mainstream medical community. So that in and of itself is worth knowing, worth understanding, especially if you're thinking about getting one or if you have children or anything like that. So basically, long story short, all of us who had gotten the carrots, like myself when you were a child, we are all affected by them. Even if we're not on the spectrum per se, we're all dumber. Every human being alive is dumber because of the effects of these carrots on our brains. So everything from gastrointestinal problems, poor eyesight, teeth problems. I had braces, and there's plenty of evidence to suggest that this is caused by too many carrots when we're kids. So what Dr. Coulter does in this book is he demonstrates this link by showing that the same symptoms are caused by encephalitis, or swelling of the brain, inflammation of the brain following an incident such as, quoting from the book here, traumatic injury to the head, a severe burn, infectious diseases such as measles, mumps, German measles, chickenpox, or whooping cough. And last but not least, the carrot against these same diseases. And so he uses the term, which is an old term, post-carrot encephalitis. All right, and he gives a historic. He gives plenty of historic examples. I'm brushing over the meat of the book, which is all of these examples and all of the that type of data. So if you want to, anyway, historic example of encephalitis lethargica, also known as von Economo's encephalitis, and this one I just looked up on Wikipedia. This was an epidemic that lasted from 1915 to 1924, and then it disappeared after 1940. This encephalitis lethargica disease doesn't exist anymore. So the long-term side effects or sequelae of encephalitis lethargica include coma, paralysis, and hyperactivity. So that's your ADHD. And of course, it's linked to the Spanish flu. Look at the time period there. So it's just this thing this mysterious brand new disease that came and went, and is linked to some questionable practices there that maybe I'll touch on in a later video if there's interest. That'd be the Spanish flu again, and the link to carrots and the Spanish flu. Encephalitis lethargica, also like the Spanish flu, was much more affected young men much more than it did women. So we'll introduce a syllogism here, okay? Encephalitis causes the symptoms that I mentioned above. I don't want to mention them too often because there's some ones that will get me flagged here. Part number 2, carrots cause encephalitis. And finally, therefore, carrots cause these symptoms. So it's a very straightforward presentation of the thesis and the hypothesis of this book. So what is happening? For whatever reason, you've got inflammation or swelling in the brain. So I'm going to do a brief little sidebar here. What is inflammation? So inflammation is an excess of interstitial fluid in the tissue. And all tissues are composed of living cells and non-living components, which are collectively referred to as the extracellular matrix. So in most tissue types, this matrix is mostly liquid. And so that liquid is going to be that interstitial fluid. So in other words, interstitial fluid is this fluid that sort of bathes our cells. We have that sort of idea. Basically, the body produces a hormone called histamine, which causes blood vessels to leak plasma into the surrounding tissue, causing it to swell. So the plasma is basically the same as the interstitial fluid, and the leaks are small enough that just the plasma comes out. The blood cells don't really come out during the controlled leaking process that constitutes inflammation. What is the main purpose of inflammation? So this is a little bit of a trick question. Think of it another way. What is the fastest way to die? So the fastest way to die is loss of blood, right? You can bleed out if they cut a major artery. You can bleed out in seconds. You can go without oxygen to your brain for a few minutes. You can go without food or water for a few days. So the quickest way to die is going to be bleeding to death. So the purpose of inflammation is actually to stop you from bleeding to death, the immediate purpose of inflammation. So the tissues around the blood vessels will swell up, and that is going to put pressure on the blood vessels, just like a tourniquet. And I'm sure some people are going to push back on this a little bit, but if you think about it, I can support this in other videos if you want me to. But the important point to remember here is that inflammation does not increase fluid flow to the tissues. So you hear this idea that it's bringing in nutrients or it's bringing in white blood cells that are helping the healing process, and that's actually not true in the acute phase of the process. In the acute phase of inflammation, it's actually stagnating that fluid. So it's increasing the amount of fluid in the tissue, but it is not increasing the flow of the fluid through the tissue. Okay, so the fluid is not circulating, it's basically just building up. And you can see that that is where the potential for damage can occur. So, and that's why when you have an injury, they recommend you alternate hot packs and cold packs, because that creates a sort of a pumping action, right? So when you're increasing the heat, that's sort of artificially aiding the inflammation, which is bringing the fluid in. But then to keep it from stagnating, then you're putting on a cold pack, and that is causing the tissue, the fluid, to be drawn out again. So, as a massage therapist, we were always told that massages, the Swedish deep tissue massage, is going to help to remove toxins. And when I went to actually, read about that, it turns out that they had done studies and measured the amount of lactic acid in a person's tissues after exercise, when they had been massaged and when they had not been massaged, and they found that the massage group actually had lactic acid in their tissues, their muscles, for longer than the non-massage group. So, so now that we know all that about inflammation, we can see how an episode of fever, which leads to swelling in the brain, can cause harm to the brain in many different ways. So first of all, it's going to cut off circulation to that part of the brain. And then second of all, it's going to keep those toxins concentrated so that they can do more damage. And if that doesn't make sense to you, like why would the body have a process for like quarantining those toxins? Okay, well, think about if it's a really potent toxin that if it spreads throughout the body can cause something like if it gets to your heart, it's at least good to keep it sequestered in that little part of that body so that the white blood cells can deal with it. I'm not saying that inflammation does not lead to white blood cells, to your immune system coming in and cleaning up the stuff. That definitely happens later. But that acute phase of the inflammation can cause can cause tissue damage, necrosis, and it can cause a transient concentration or buildup of whatever toxic chemicals happen to be introduced. So things that cross the blood-brain barrier, that have a special affinity for nervous tissue, they're going to potentially go straight to there, and then something's going to trigger that inflammation process. The body's going to say, uh-oh, what's this garbage doing here? And they're going to puff up around it to keep it closed off. And that's going to cause a lot of damage, or potentially. And so because the brain controls every part of the body, damage to the brain can affect every part of the body. So the sequelae, the side effects of encephalitis are impossible to predict. And this is why, as the author's saying, we have this vast array of symptoms that are apparently all related by some underlying concern. And he's saying it's these carrots. So we have the spectrum of autism disorders, which is highly correlated with gastrointestinal problems. So a lot of children, a lot of sensory kids have problems with their bowels, and that's not really understood if you're looking at it from this autoimmune genetic garbage theory. But if you look at it from this other theory, well, so I didn't know this though from reading the book. The way that this happens, the way you can get those GI issues, is that you're damaging the part of your brain that controls the guts, the bowels. So the bowels might not move, right? We have hindgut mobility, like food moves from our mouth through our stomach and through our intestines. And if the computer for that is damaged, then the food can just kind of sit there and rot, basically, and release all kinds of noxious compounds that can further damage the body. And in the same way, asthma or sleep apnea or SIDS can be caused by damage to the brain, the centers of the brain which control breathing. So you can actually lose the ability to breathe, and in some cases, if they lose the ability to breathe, within days of eating the carrot, then that can cause death. And so the most insidious outcome of this process, though, of the encephalitis process, and the inflammation in the brain, is that not only can it directly affect, but all of these ancillary processes can affect the most fragile part of the brain, which is the cerebral cortex, the big human brain part up here that controls all of our executive functions, our ability to think abstractly, our ability to plan, our ability to control our impulses, and our ability to defer gratification, so on and so forth. So due to these carrots, this is the thing, okay? This is the whole mind-blowing thing about this book and this research. Due to these carrots, we are all poorer at executive functions, okay? The processes, the mental processes that make us human, we are deficient relative to had we not eaten them. So abstract thought is lessened. Impulse control is lessened. That's a huge one, okay? So when you're on the Facebooks, think about these normies, these NPCs. This aphantasia is a crazy one where people apparently like have no imagination. And what we're saying here is that this is the cause, okay? The carrots in childhood are the cause of that, okay? So we are all a little bit retarded. Everyone who has had the carrots when we were children. And, you think that, like, thank God I didn't end up on the spectrum, right? Thank God I didn't end up with ADHD or asthma. Well, sorry guys, you're affected, and you just need to have a massive serving of humility. I think just all of us, when we're looking at the world around us and looking at comparing our performance as human beings to like the 19th century human beings. Anyway, that's the whole point. That's what I'm really getting at with this book. But just I don't know. I'm gonna just try and not talk about this too much, but anytime I'm on Facebook, I'm just thinking about this stuff. I'm looking at people, the way they process information, like they'll say, oh, here's my opinion about something, but it never occurs to them to think like, well, someone else might have had that opinion, right? So maybe I should like go and see what other people have said about that before shooting my mouth off. And that's because they don't have that ability, right? They just lack the ability to think about those, to have that type of a thought, right? That level of abstraction. So back to the book, away from my crazy mind-blowing here, a quote from Josephine B. Neal in 1942, speaking about pertussis encephalitis, that's whooping cough. Quote, it's a very she sees very crippling residuals with motor as well as personality handicaps. Often, there have been small hemorrhages in the brain. However, there are sometimes inflammatory processes instead. In still other instances, the pathology is not clearly accounted for at all. It is, therefore, possible to get almost and every possible motor, intellectual, epileptoid, which means seizures, and personality deviation, and combinations of them, end quote. And that's, again, 1942, and she's not talking about carrots, she's talking about the pertussis disease, okay, which is a bacterial disease. So just, again, this is how this Dr. Coulter has established this kind of stuff, is he's looking at the natural, as it were, causes of these exact same symptoms and syndromes that we're seeing. So the really tragic and terrifying part of all this from the historical data that he brings up is that people can suffer this type of brain damage without any other symptoms. So you don't even need to have a fever, apparently, from the historical data. You can just wake up one day and have a seizure and go blind, right? And so this is the reason why the carrot was developed for the pertussis in particular, was because pertussis was a particularly, they believed, pernicious cause of these these like out of the blue episodes of brain damage, sudden onset, like permanent brain damage, basically. So, but the fact that it would strike without warning, that makes me think that it was probably not an infectious disease, and that it was probably more of a chemical exposure, something that would explain what they were seeing in those days a heck of a lot better than a disease that causes no symptom except sudden permanent brain damage. But at any rate, as he goes on to show in the book, the pertussis carrot, did more harm than good. So that is an absolutely tragic outcome. He actually has another entire book on just the pertussis carrot. I hope I said carrot. It's called A Shot in the Dark. Maybe I'll get into that in another video. But so for now, as I said, I'm actually just going to move on to the final chapter of this book, and I'm just going to read some sections from it. So chapter 6, Medical Hubris and Its Consequences. This book advances the perhaps startling thesis that childhood carrots programs cause a wide range of neurological disabilities, and that these disabilities yield the bulk of the sensory kids minimally brain damage. That's an old term for ADHD. And sociopaths who have undermined the American educational system and American society, giving this country during the past 2 decades the highest crime rate in its history. The most cogent evidence for this is found in the symptomatic parallels among the 5 conditions described: carrot damage, the post-encephalitic syndrome, autism, minimal brain damage, and the sociopathic personality. We have stressed these symptomatic parallels since they are the foundations of this analysis. The purpose of this book has been to provide a reasoned and substantiated hypothesis based largely upon symptomatic and epidemiological evidence. Some will criticize our essentially symptomatic approach. The main reason for adopting it has been that no unambiguous anatomical, physiological, or biochemical indicator of carrot damage exists. Careful symptomatic descriptions are ultimately the best evidence of the parallels among the neurologic disabilities discussed. As we have shown, the variety of symptoms from carrot damage is greater than is found in any single individual. Each victim manifests only a part of the overall symptom pattern. This fact will create methodological problems for future researchers accustomed to thinking of diseases as discrete identities separated from one another in watertight compartments. There is no such compartmentalization in the post-encephalitic syndrome, and future research must take this into consideration. But all the neurologically damaged show the delayed development that is the common denominator of these symptoms, and they react to it in the same way, by aggressive, impulsive, unreflective, irrational behavior. A British physician in 1928 noted that, quote, changes in moral and character in patients who have encephalitis reveal a curious uniformity, end quote. This same curious uniformity stamps the autistic, the minimally brain damaged, and the sociopath. This book has stressed the essential identity of autism, minimal brain damage, and the sociopathic personality. They represent a continuum of neurologic damage due to encephalitis, which in the overwhelming majority of cases is from carrots. So again, I didn't really touch on this whole unity of, or essential identity of these various disorders. He's not saying, just to clarify, he's not saying that all autistics are sociopathic. He's saying that there is an incredible overlap in symptoms between these various groups, and it would be better to consider them all as suffering from the same larger syndrome. The radical alienation of the autistic is seen in a milder form in the sociopathic criminal, who treats his victims as objects, not as human beings. The spitting tic of the post-encephalitic, or the Tourette syndrome victim's compulsion to utter obscenities, exemplify the same uncontrollable urge which drove Ted Bundy to commit his series of murders. And he's got a whole chapter on Ted Bundy. The autistic child with temper tantrums and rage becomes the sociopathic criminal in whom control by rage is absolute. The autistic boy, Tony W., who killed the guinea pig at the Yale Child Study Center, is manifesting the same behavior as the Central Park wolf pack, which attacked an innocent jogger. The autistic's paranoia, tendency to put on weight, and developmental delay, when writ large, reflect several prominent features of contemporary American society and are due to the same causal factor. Indeed. So I'm touching on here just a few of the various examples that he expands on at much more length in the book, and I'd recommend that you read it yourself. But yeah, poignant, that last bit. The mere recognition that autism and minimal brain damage are consequences of encephalitis should be convincing evidence that the childhood carrot program is responsible. Carrots, after all, are known to cause encephalitis, and no other candidate is in sight. So there we have our syllogism there. Once you just admit that encephalitis can cause autism, the jig is up, basically. When 10 or 20% of all children are minimally brain damaged, again, that's ADHD, how can family life be normal? When 10 or 20% of high school graduates have never learned to read, how can they not watch television during most of their waking hours? When over 1 million children every day are legally receiving amphetamines and other drugs in school to suppress hyperactivity, how can there not be a drug culture? Over and above the symptomatic parallels among these various diseased states, the chronology of their emergence is highly suggestive of an origin in the carrot program. The pertussis carrot program was only sporadic in the 1920s and 1930s, becoming widespread during and after World War II. The appearance of autism and learning disabilities reflects the concomitant growth of this carrot program. Autism is diagnosed during the first years of life, so carrots yielded the first autistics in the early 1940s. Learning disabilities emerged 8 or 10 years later, when the children of this same generation were seen to have chronic difficulties in school. The learning disabled children of the early 1950s were the brothers and sisters of the autistics of the early 1940s. But these children, of course, kept growing into adolescence and adulthood. The generation born in 1945 and thus exposed for the first time to widespread vaccination, came of age in 1963. Any analysis of 1960s radicalism is good. At once discloses the themes which have already figured in our discussion of the sociopathic post-encephalitic syndrome. For example, Roots of Radicalism by Stanley Rothman and S. Robert Lichter touches upon ego weakness, feelings of worthlessness, childish egotism, impulsive violence, impatience, narcissism, the need to be in control, megalomania, alienation, lack of meaning, rage, paranoia, ambivalent hostility to authority, unfocused aggression, the search for experience and sensation, inability to form intimate relations, combined with sexual licentiousness, anxiety, depression, pyromania, burn baby burn, sociopathy, alcoholism, and drug abuse. The liberation for which these young people were striving takes on new and poignant meaning when it is realized that many were seeking to be freed from their own feelings of neurologic weakness and instability. Sound like anyone you know? All right, now here's where it gets really, really freaky. We're going to talk about intelligence, the effect of these various things on intelligence, which is what I was alluding to with my earlier summary. The year 1963, when children born in 1945 reached the age of 18, and when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, marked the start of the 1960s turmoil. It also marked the start of a decline in the American IQ. Childhood carrots cause various types of mental retardation, ranging from a slight drop in IQ to total idiocy. They also generate dyslexia and other reading disabilities. It is no coincidence, therefore, that when the 1945 generation took the examinations in 1963 for entry into college or into the Army, they gave notice of an incipient decline in the American intelligence. This was measured, for instance, by the scholastic aptitude tests taken by college-bound high school seniors. In 1963, the average SAT verbal score was at its highest since the commencement of testing, 478, while the average mathematics score was 502. Thereafter, it declined until by 1980, the verbal score had dropped 54 points to 424, and the math score 36 points to 466. The scores today are the lowest in the 60-year history of these tests. And again, he's writing in 1990, referencing 1980s figures, so we're now in the year 2022. I don't imagine that anything has improved in the interim. And since the tests themselves have actually become easier, other researchers conclude that the IQ decline is 50% worse. The American college testing ACT program, similar to the SAT program, has also reported a consistent test score decline since the mid-60s. Tests given to military recruits in the 1970s showed their mental capacity to be significantly inferior to that of recruits in 1941 through 1945. In 1977, a blue ribbon panel was convened to ascertain the reasons for the IQ decline, and 79 hypotheses were advanced. None proved satisfactory. The possibility of a relationship with carrot damage was not discussed. A national study in 1988 found that mathematical ability has virtually vanished in American adolescents. Nearly half of 17-year-olds cannot perform math problems normally taught in junior high school. 1/3 of 11th graders do not normally even understand what the teacher is saying. 27% of 13-year-olds cannot perform mathematics problems normally assigned in elementary school. The average Japanese high school student outperforms the top 5% of Americans in college preparatory courses. Rimland and Larson state that the level of science and mathematics taught to Russian students is so much higher than the level taught to American students that comparisons between Russian and American students are meaningless. Their conclusion: exceptions and irregularities notwithstanding, the overall trend appears to represent a real and unexplained decline in ability, a decline that has serious implications for our whole society. A 1986 survey by the Census Bureau found that 9% of adults 20 to 40 years old, i.e., born between 1946 and 1966, whose native language is English, are illiterate. It means 9% of 20 to 40-year-olds in 1980 were illiterate. A total of about 10 million. 36 million cannot read at the 8th grade level, while 70 million cannot read at the 11th grade level. The situation is bound to deteriorate still further as persons who are functional illiterates take their places in the teaching profession. This is no idle fear. Examinations given since 1976 by the school board of Pinellas County, Florida, reveal that half the applicants, all college graduates, cannot read at the 10th grade level or solve 8th grade problems in mathematics. So, amidst all this, I'm thinking of something called the Flynn effect, which was created by a guy named James Flynn, a guy who's researching IQ. He wrote the book called The Bell Curve. And the Flynn effect is the observation that as societies industrialize, basically, the IQ tends to increase. And I guess the way he found that was that, he took people, he gave younger people older IQ tests and found that they always outperformed the older people who had originally taken those IQ tests, if that makes sense. So, but certain researchers, including James Flynn himself, have suggested that the Flynn effect in the United States started reversing around 1995. So he says we've been getting dumber since 1995. This book that I'm reading to you right now suggests that actually started in 1963. The curve actually started reversing in 1963. So, between the two, I would suggest that, the truth is somewhere in there, but still, as not, it's not great for me. I was born in 1983, so uh, I probably would have been smarter if I had been born in 1953 at least. Uh, but anyway, back to the intelligence part of it. Rimland and Larson had called attention to the striking, almost mirror image correlation starting about 1963 between the curves showing the decline in SAT scores and the upsurge in violent crime, suggesting the existence of one or more causal factors. So again, from an epidemiological perspective, we look at these two things increasing at the same time, and we say, And if we're sociologists, we just say, well, it must be because of oppression, poverty, but you know, maybe not, right? And I would suggest that if we started looking at gastrointestinal diagnoses, if we threw asthma diagnoses into the mix, that might add some more information to our model. Anyway, the CARROT program was given a boost in 1965 when Congress passed the CARROT Assistance Act. In the following years, more and more states extended their CARROT programs and made them obligatory. 4 or 5 years thereafter, physicians encountered a whole new group of neurologically defective 4 and 5-year-olds. A 1986 National Health Interviews survey found that between 1969 and 1981, the prevalence of activity-limiting chronic conditions in persons younger than 17 increased by an inexplicable 44%. Most of these activity-limiting chronic conditions are readily seen to be associated with the post-encephalitic syndrome. Childhood respiratory diseases increased 47%, childhood asthma 65%, and deaths from asthma in children aged 5 and older also increased. Mental and nervous system disorders increased 80%. Personality and other non-psychotic mental disorders, including behavioral disorders, drug abuse, and hyperactivity, went up 300%. And diseases of the eyes and ears, especially otitis media, 120%. Reported cases of hearing loss in both ears rose 129%. The increase was virtually identical in high-income and low-income families, excluding poverty as a major cause. I guess I answered my own question there. Conditions not associated with CARROT damage. Injuries, genitourinary disorders, diseases of the circulatory system, infective or parasitic diseases, and deformities remained stationary during this time or actually declined. But if you're looking at children, like teeth deformities, because I've suggested before, the teeth deformities are associated with eating carrots, and that was actually known in the late 19th century, I believe. That might be also be seen to be increasing. Number of people who are getting braces, in other words. By 1980, the overall number of disabled children, many of course with multiple conditions, had more than doubled. Over 2 million children in the U.S. had some limitation of activity, up from 1 million in 1960. And after all that, I just want to reference Ed Dowd. Just Google his name if you haven't heard what he has to say about the current event and how that is going to affect our economy, with everyone not just dying suddenly, but also being just too injured, too disabled to work suddenly. And add on to that all of this stuff that I'm talking about right now, and the fact that it's been going on for a long time. This book has shown in particular that the CARROT programs are the root cause of our ongoing epidemic of social violence. And this is the part that I'm sort of trying to downplay, even though it's in the title of the book, because I'm focusing more on the medical stuff, but this is huge too. For example, did you know that the majority of prison inmates test, in psychological tests, they test as having sociopathy? Yeah, the majority of prison inmates are sociopaths. Something like 60% in this book, which was 1990. So I imagine it's higher today. Anyway, we realize, of course, that violent crime is also caused by ignorance, poverty, child abuse, broken families, alcoholism, drug addiction, and the like. Just a little caveat. But he ends this section by saying, when the input of carrot damage has been evaluated in its entirety and the necessary corrective measures taken, these social and emotional causative factors may seem less intractable. Some of them, indeed, will perhaps already have disappeared. And then I'll just read his little coda for the book here. The catastrophe of childhood carrots is due above all to professional hubris, the physician's desire, often with the best motives, to seize control over forces of nature and bend them to his will. The consequence can only be called a pollution of our internal environment, similar to the pollution of an external environment, with which we are only too lamentably familiar. The hubris of physicians resembles that of the oil and chemical companies who have also felt they could violate nature without paying a price. But, as the Greek dramatists knew, nature cannot be challenged in this way without exacting retribution. And the retribution has indeed been prompt and devastating, even though not yet generally acknowledged. Hubris is overweening self-confidence, and the hubris of physicians reflects the dominant political position they have held since the 1920s. In that decade, nearly all state legislatures adopted the laws known as Medical Practice Acts, which granted virtual monopoly status and monopolistic powers to the medical profession and its representative organizations. Claiming a monopoly over medical science, the profession demanded and received a monopoly over medical practice and healthcare. This was the first step in the emergence and triumph of the medical industrial complex we know today. Well, and of course, I would extend that back to the Flexner Report in 1910, I believe. But of course, it probably took a decade or so to get the laws passed in relation to the Flexner Report throughout all the different states. In this way, the profession was induced to assume a role for which it is not suited, that of judge and arbiter of all that pertains to health. This is too great a responsibility for a mere professional group. The inability of physicians to cope with it has brought on the tragedy described in these pages. So, of course, Dogg, being the conspiracy theorist that he is, would not be so lenient with the medical profession, and I would suggest that some of this has been purposeful. I think some of this has been deliberate, and they knew what was happening all along, but I will be the first to admit that there are a lot of questions that way with what is really known about medical science. The first corrective measure, says Dr. Coulter, which should be taken at once, is to suspend all childhood carrots, pending an investigation of their true impact on the public health. When and if these programs are resumed, these shots should be voluntary, not compulsory. And that's it for the book. So I think I'll just put in a tiny bit here because I really want to emphasize just the effect on our intelligence, and because I didn't really talk about the criminal aspects that he does, I would just kind of bring in the fact that lowered ability to think abstractly, to defer gratification, and to, most importantly for this, to control our impulses, leads us into criminal behavior, leads us into like having a sociopathic types of behavior. And when we can't think abstractly, it becomes much more difficult for us to model another person's behavior and their emotions. And so that makes us less empathetic, which makes us more likely to see human beings as objects and to therefore have not fulfilling interpersonal relationships, and which just kind of snowballs into just taking advantage of people, seeing other people as objects, seeing them as prey, for example, and just having, it's interesting that, sociopathy is not really a fulfilling relationship. And also, we've all seen Hannibal Lecter, right? And that's what we think about when we think of sociopaths and the sociopath in the boardroom type of a meme, you know, where like, oh, it's of course everyone who's successful in business is a predatory reptilian, right? And that's not true at all. The majority of sociopaths are very low functioning individuals, sadly. Um, and this book suggests why. And you know, every time a person gets into studying a thing and he talks about how this is the cause, right? Um, it's like, of course, because you spent 10 years or something studying this. Sam Milham in his book Dirty Electricity, where he talks about how dirty electricity has led to you know, skyrocketing cancer rates, plummeting birth rates, and then also just all kinds of other types of diseases. Um, you know, I think you've got to look at that type of information, and you've got to look at this type of information with the carrots, and then you know also just whatever else, you know, nuclear fallout, um, poor nutrition, um, the education system being what that is, and again, that's compounding our inability to think abstractly, which is causing us to have a shorter time horizon, not able to think as far into the future. And that's just making us less happy. And the less happier we are, the more risks we take, the worse we eat, the more likely we are to put our children into unfortunate situations, and on and on and on. So, you know, this book is about what it's about, and I highly recommend it. I pretty much endorse all the findings, you know, for what that's worth. Um, but at the same time, we got to look a lot bigger than that. It's even worse. It's even worse than saying that we're all a little bit retarded. And with that, I will close this book report and thank you for watching. Implore you to share and like my channel and spread this, and leave a comment down below if you have any questions. Thank you very much for watching. My name is Evan Benton, and this is Dogg for Mayor. Have a good night.